Get on the ground now! Hands behind your head or we'll shoot! The scream ripped through the quiet Alabama morning like thunder, sharp and violent, making the still air tremble. Red and blue lights exploded across the grassy field as 3 police cruisers skidded into formation. Boxing Jordan Carter in, doors flew open, boots pounded gravel, and the sound of safeties clicking off filled the air like an execution line loading their rifles. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Jordan Carter stood frozen at the edge of his newly purchased 80-acre property, the weight of the moment pressing hard on his chest. His breathing slowed, steady but tense, his mind racing as he raised his hands slowly into the humid August air. The faint smell of damp earth mixed with the metallic tang of fear on his tongue, but his voice stayed calm. "My name is Jordan Carter," he said clearly, his deep tone steady, controlled. "I own this property. My papers are in the truck." Sergeant Derek Sullivan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and a jaw clenched tight as stone, stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the gravel. He narrowed his icy blue eyes at Jordan, his voice low, controlled, yet dripping with threat. "Owner? That's funny. This here's Thornton land. You're trespassing, and you better shut your mouth before things get ugly." Behind him, Deputy Mia Delgado barked louder, her hand gripping her Glock so tightly her knuckles turned pale. "Face down! Hands where I can see them!" Her voice cracked like a whip, sharp and unrelenting, each word soaked in aggression. Jordan felt his heart pounding, but 20 years as an FBI agent had taught him composure under fire. He wasn't here as a developer, as the cover story claimed. He was here on a covert mission, Operation Starfall, to investigate Cedarville's deep-rooted corruption. But that wasn't something Sullivan could know. He had to stay in character, calm, collected, and ordinary. He raised his voice slightly, enough to cut through the chaos without sounding confrontational. "I said, I own this land." Sullivan's lip curled into a mocking smirk, his voice loud enough for his deputies to hear. "You own 80 acres of prime Cedarville land? Don't make me laugh." He waved a hand at Delgado. "Search the truck. Let's see what this guy's really hiding." Delgado moved fast, her boots crunching over loose stones as she yanked open the driver's side door, tossing papers, receipts, and glove box contents onto the dirt. Her movements were jerky, urgent, too deliberate. Jordan watched her carefully, memorizing every step, every glance, every piece of evidence being staged. And then she froze, turning with triumph burning in her eyes, holding up a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Drugs." "Sarge!" she shouted. "Got him!" The words landed like a thunderclap. Jordan's jaw clenched as his pulse roared in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening. This was a setup, a playbook he had seen in dozens of corruption cases: intimidation, planted evidence, coerced confessions, without hesitation. He subtly tapped the edge of his watch, activating the hidden recording system built into the band. The device silently transmitted his GPS coordinates and live audio feed directly to Director Elena Vasquez at FBI headquarters. Sullivan strode closer, looming over him, a predator circling its prey. Well, trespassing and possession? That's a bad look. "Carter, guess you're coming with us." He grabbed Jordan by the shoulder, spinning him around with force, slamming him against the hood of his truck. The cold metal bit into his cheek as Sullivan's knee dug into his back, pinning him hard. Pain shot up Jordan's spine, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Delgado leaned close, her breath hot against his ear, her words a venomous whisper meant to wound. "Wrong town. Boy." The sting of those words cut deep, heavier than the knee grinding into his ribs. because they weren't just personal. They carried the weight of history, of Cedarville's long, ugly shadow of racial injustice. Jordan's mind flashed back to 1990, to his mother Evelyn being dragged out of a community meeting by these same uniforms, framed for disorderly conduct, imprisoned for 7 years to silence her activism. He had sworn then that no one would suffer like she did. Now, here he was, in the same town, on the same soil, facing the same system. He inhaled slowly, deeply, grounding himself, pushing past the rush of anger rising in his chest. He couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. "My papers are in the glove box," he repeated, his voice calm, unshaken, commanding without defiance. Sullivan ignored him, his grip tightening, his knee pressing harder into Jordan's back until the breath left his lungs. "Save it for the judge," Sullivan sneered. Lucas Hayes, the youngest deputy on the scene, stood a few steps back, hands trembling slightly as he watched the scene unfold. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously, sweat beading at his temple beneath his cap. He didn't speak, but Jordan noticed his shifting stance, the way his eyes darted between Sullivan and Delgado as if silently questioning everything happening around him. That told Jordan something important. Hayes wasn't fully on their side. Jordan filed it away, even as Sullivan yanked his arms roughly behind his back, cold cuffs biting into his wrists. Delgado stepped forward, holding up the plastic bag like a trophy. "This is gonna stick." "Carter," she said, her grin sharp and cruel. "We don't like outsiders here." Jordan said nothing. He didn't need to. Every second of this was being captured, transmitted, stored. Operation Starfall wasn't just about uncovering corruption anymore. This was personal. He glanced toward the tree line, just beyond his property line, where he had discovered military-grade surveillance equipment earlier that morning, hidden thermal cameras, motion sensors, tech far too advanced for any small-town department. Someone powerful was watching him, and he was standing right in the middle of their game board. Sullivan leaned down close, his voice low and threatening. "You want my advice? Carter, sell this land, leave Cedarville, or you're gonna end up buried under it." Jordan's breath came slow and steady. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't give Sullivan a thing to work with. Behind him, Hayes finally stepped forward, his voice quiet but shaking. "Sarge, maybe we should verify his paperwork first, just to cover ourselves." Sullivan shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Back in line." "Hayes," he barked, his tone loaded with authority. Hayes swallowed hard and obeyed, but his jaw tightened, another sign of cracks forming in the ranks. Jordan stored it all away. He would need Hayes later. As they dragged him toward the cruiser, Delgado leaned in one last time, her voice low, her tone mocking, almost playful. "Welcome to Cedarville, Mr. Carter. Hope you like our hospitality." Jordan stayed silent, but inside, his resolve burned hotter than ever. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a declaration of war. The town didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change, and the first battle had just begun. The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the cold, dimly lit halls of the Cedarville Sheriff's Department. Jordan Carter sat cuffed to a metal chair inside a small, windowless room that smelled faintly of bleach and damp concrete, the overhead fluorescent light buzzing with a harsh, sterile glow. The table before him was scratched and dented, the kind of table built to intimidate rather than comfort. Across from him stood Sergeant Derek Sullivan, arms crossed, his icy stare locked on Jordan like a hunter sizing up his prey. Deputy Mia Delgado leaned against the wall with her Glock holstered, her arms folded tight, her eyes sharp and restless, waiting for the moment she could pounce. Jordan sat calm and silent, his breathing steady, his wrists still sore from the cuffs digging into his skin. Years of FBI training taught him that silence was a weapon. He would not waste a single word unless it served a purpose. But Sullivan didn't waste time. He slammed a thick folder onto the table, papers spilling out in a deliberate show of force. "You know," Sullivan began, his tone low but laced with venom. "Guys like you think you're smarter than the rest of us. You come down here from Birmingham, wearing your fancy watch, thinking you can buy 80 acres of Cedarville land without anyone asking questions." He leaned in, his breath hot, his words sharp. "So here's my question. Carter, how does a man like you afford property like this? Drug money? Fraud? What is it?" Jordan met his glare without flinching. "I already told you," he said calmly, his voice deep and measured. "I'm a developer. My papers are in the truck." Delgado barked out a bitter laugh, pacing the small room like a caged predator. "A developer. Huh? That's cute." She stopped abruptly, leaning on the table with both hands, her face inches from his. "You think you can come into Cedarville and pretend you belong here? People like you don't belong here. Carter, you don't fit." Her words hung heavy in the air, the unspoken racial undertone as sharp as a blade. Jordan didn't respond. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his gaze steady and unyielding, his recording watch capturing every word, every insult, every calculated threat. Deputy Lucas Hayes stood quietly near the door, his posture stiff, his expression tense. He looked younger than his badge suggested, his jaw clenched tightly as his gaze flicked nervously between Sullivan, Delgado, and Jordan. Hayes didn't speak, but Jordan caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, a tiny crack in the facade of loyalty. Sullivan slammed his hand against the table, the sound loud and deliberate, breaking the silence. "Here's how this works," he said, leaning closer. "We found drugs in your truck. That's enough to put you away for 5 years without blinking. You want to explain how that happened? Or you want me to make sure you disappear before sunrise?" Delgado smiled coldly at the threat, her arms crossed tightly. Jordan kept his breathing even, his voice calm. "I don't do drugs," he said simply, "and those weren't in my truck when I parked it." Delgado's laugh was sharp, mocking, and cruel. "Sure. Carter, keep telling yourself that. You're not the first big-talking outsider who thought he could outsmart Cedarville PD." Her voice dropped to a whisper meant to sting. "They all leave here the same way. Broken." Jordan leaned back slightly in his chair, his silence deliberate, his expression controlled, giving them nothing to feed on. That restraint seemed to agitate Sullivan even more. "You think this is a game?" Sullivan growled, leaning down until his face hovered inches above Jordan's. "You're gonna learn quick. Boy, that Cedarville belongs to us. You either play by our rules, or you don't play at all." For the first time. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat softly. "Sarge," he started, his voice quiet but trembling slightly. "Maybe we should run his papers first, just to cover ourselves." Sullivan whipped his head around so fast that Hayes flinched. "You questioning me? Rookie?" Sullivan's voice cut through the air like a whip, his tone full of authority and warning. Hayes swallowed hard and stepped back into silence, his hands behind his back. But Jordan saw it, that moment of hesitation, the sliver of doubt. That was leverage. Suddenly, Delgado tossed a manila envelope onto the table, sliding it toward Jordan. Inside were photographs, aerial shots of his land, close-ups of his truck, even zoomed-in images of his cabin's windows. Jordan glanced down, his stomach tightening slightly, but his face remained neutral. He knew surveillance when he saw it, and this was far beyond what a rural department like Cedarville could afford. Military-grade cameras, motion sensors, thermal imaging. Someone far more powerful than Sullivan was orchestrating this. Delgado leaned in, her voice low, taunting. "You see these? You're being watched. Carter, every move you make, every step you take. You think this is about a little piece of land? She smirked. You're standing on history, and history doesn't belong to you. Jordan's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't take the bait. He leaned forward slowly, his deep voice calm, steady, deliberate. You're making a mistake, he said. Sullivan laughed, but it was cold, humorless, full of arrogance. The only mistake I see, he spat, is you thinking Cedarville's gonna let someone like you walk in here and take what's ours? Delgado's phone buzzed, and she checked it quickly, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly before she schooled it back to neutral. Jordan caught it. Something was happening outside this room. He subtly tapped his watch twice, sending a coded alert to Director Elena Vasquez, a silent call for backup, across the table. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as if savoring his control of the situation. But Jordan noticed the cracks forming. Hayes' unease, Delgado's hidden tension, Sullivan's forced composure. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever Cedarville PD thought they were doing, they had no idea what storm they were walking into. 10 minutes later, Sullivan stepped out to take a phone call, leaving Delgado to circle the room like a restless predator. She stopped suddenly, leaning close enough that Jordan could see the faint scar along her jawline. You think you're clever, don't you? She hissed, her tone sharp with resentment. You think you're better than us, with your fancy truck and your clean shoes. But let me tell you something. Carter, Cedarville doesn't want you here. Her words were heavy, deliberate, laced with something deeper than hostility. Jordan finally looked up, meeting her stare dead on, his voice low, even, unshaken. I'm not here to play games. Deputy, for a moment. Delgado's smirk faltered, replaced by something harder, more personal. But before she could respond, the door creaked open, and Hayes stepped forward quietly. Placing a small paper cup of water on the table, he avoided eye contact. But as he set it down, he slipped a folded note beneath Jordan's hand so smoothly that Delgado didn't notice. Jordan kept his movements calm, casual, unfolding the note discreetly beneath the table, in hurried, messy handwriting. It read, They're setting you up. Your prince triggered a federal alert. Be careful who you trust. Jordan folded the note, sliding it into his palm, his mind processing the meaning instantly. A federal alert. That meant Sullivan and Delgado knew more than they were saying. It meant they were scared, and scared people made mistakes. Delgado leaned forward again, her tone sharp. This doesn't have to get ugly. Carter, cooperate, and maybe we cut you a deal. Jordan let out the faintest breath of laughter, just enough to break the tension without provoking her. I'll pass, he said calmly, his gaze locked on hers. Delgado's lips thinned into a tight line, her jaw clenching hard, but she said nothing more. Outside the door, muffled voices rose suddenly, fast and sharp, the sound of urgency, of something unraveling. Jordan's watch vibrated softly. The coded signal returned. Backup was closer than they realized, and as Sullivan re-entered the room, face flushed with anger, Jordan knew this was far from over. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was war, and the first shot had already been fired. The tension inside the interrogation room was suffocating, every second stretching longer than the last, when the hallway outside suddenly erupted with the sound of rapid footsteps and raised voices. Doors slammed, radios crackled, and a commanding voice cut through the chaos. Federal agents! Everyone stay where you are! The words hit like a thunderclap. Sergeant Derek Sullivan whipped his head toward the door, his face hardening into disbelief. But before he could react, the heavy steel door burst open and Director Elena Vasquez stepped in, her black FBI jacket catching the glare of the overhead lights. Behind her, 4 armed federal agents swept into the room with precision, rifles raised but steady, their movements crisp and controlled. Elena's voice was sharp, cold, and unwavering as she locked eyes on Sullivan. "Step away from Special Agent Jordan Carter. Now." The silence in the room was deafening for a moment, broken only by the buzz of the old fluorescent light above. Sullivan's jaw worked as if grinding steel, his hand instinctively reaching toward the radio clipped to his vest before he caught himself. "What the hell is this?" he growled, his voice tight but shaky under the weight of her authority. "This man is under arrest for trespassing and drug possession." Elena didn't flinch, her gaze cutting through him like glass. "This man," she said, her voice low but carrying the full weight of federal power, "is Special Agent Jordan Carter, badge number 92741, assigned to Operation Starfall, a federal investigation into widespread corruption within Cedarville's Sheriff's Department." Her words hung in the air like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Delgado stiffened, her face blanching as her hand dropped from her holster. Hayes, standing in the corner, froze entirely, his breathing shallow, eyes darting between Jordan and Elena like someone watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. Sullivan tried to regain control, squaring his shoulders as his voice rose, his anger spilling through clenched teeth. "That's a lie. He's no agent. He's a damn trespasser, and we've got evidence to prove it." Elena stepped forward slowly, her boots striking the concrete floor with deliberate force, stopping just inches from Sullivan. "You planted drugs in his truck, forged a false trespassing report, and held a federal agent without notifying the Bureau. Do you understand what that means? Sergeant, that's obstruction of justice, violation of civil rights, and conspiracy against the United States government." Her words sliced clean and merciless, stripping away the illusion of control Sullivan had been clinging to. The agents fanned out across the room, two taking positions near Delgado, one near Hayes, and the last by the door. Jordan finally stood, the cuffs still on his wrists, but his posture unbroken, his gaze steady as he spoke for the first time since the FBI arrived. "Remove these cuffs," he said quietly but firmly, his deep voice carrying authority Sullivan couldn't ignore. For a moment, Sullivan hesitated, his pride warring with reality, until Elena's sharp command snapped him back. "Now." "Sergeant." Delgado stepped forward reluctantly, pulling the key from her belt and unlocking the cuffs, her movements stiff and mechanical, her jaw tight with frustration. Jordan rubbed his wrists briefly, ignoring the sting, and stood tall, his presence filling the small room. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but controlled, then turned his attention back to Sullivan. "For 24 months. We've been investigating your department, civil rights violations, land grabs, false arrests, and now you've handed us evidence on a silver platter." Sullivan's face flushed crimson, veins bulging at his temples, but before he could respond, Elena gave a quick hand signal, and one of her agents stepped forward, placing a warrant on the table. "By federal order," Elena announced, her voice ringing with finality. "We are seizing this facility's servers, case files, and evidence lockers effective immediately." The impact of her words rippled through the room like an earthquake. Delgado's bravado cracked. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped back. Hayes exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if relieved. Outside in the hallway, voices rose in confusion as federal agents began flooding the department, securing offices, removing hard drives, and confiscating documents. The old building vibrated with tension, its walls bearing witness to decades of corruption finally being ripped open. Jordan glanced at Hayes, locking eyes with him briefly, catching the flicker of conflict behind them, guilt, fear, but also a sliver of hope. He filed it away. Hayes would be important later. Turning back to Elena, he spoke in a low tone meant only for her ears. "They found surveillance on my land," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "Military grade, thermal sensors, motion triggers. That's not local law enforcement. Elena's sharp eyes narrowed instantly, her jaw tightening. Then someone's feeding them resources, she replied under her breath. We need to know who... Her gaze shifted back to Sullivan, her voice rising again. Sergeant, you're suspended effective immediately, pending federal investigation. Deputy Delgado, same goes for you. If either of you interferes, you'll be in federal custody by sundown. Delgado bristled, her face hardening. You can't just waltz in here and shut us down, she snapped, but her voice faltered halfway through, betraying the uncertainty behind her defiance. Elena stepped closer, her tone sharp and cold. Watch me, with those two words. Delgado fell silent, her fists clenching tightly at her sides. The chaos outside escalated as more federal agents moved through the station, collecting boxes of files, hard drives, and internal reports. The sounds of drawers slamming and computers shutting down echoed like the death rattle of a regime long overdue to fall. Jordan finally addressed Sullivan again, his voice calm, controlled, and deliberate. For years, you've terrorized families in this county. You've planted evidence, seized homes, destroyed lives, all to line the pockets of people hiding behind power and privilege. That ends today. Sullivan's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter, his silence heavier than any denial he could offer. Hayes shifted slightly at the door, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Sir, he said quietly, looking at Jordan. What happens now? Jordan turned toward him, his expression softening just slightly as he responded. Now, he said slowly, his deep voice carrying across the room with measured weight. Now the real investigation begins. Elena nodded in agreement, already flipping open a secured tablet, pulling up files as she gave rapid instructions to her agents. Secure the evidence lockers, pull their last 6 months of arrest reports, and I want an immediate trace on the surveillance tech found on Carter's property. Somebody outside this county is bankrolling this operation. Delgado stiffened at that, her eyes darting instinctively toward Sullivan, whose face remained stone cold but betrayed a flash of something Jordan didn't miss. Fear. Hayes caught it too, his brows furrowing slightly, his mind working fast. He stepped forward tentatively, his voice low but firm. If you want the truth, he said, glancing at Jordan. I can help you. I've seen things here, things I shouldn't have. Files, sealed reports, meetings at the Cedarville Golf Club after hours. It's bigger than you think. Jordan studied him carefully, his expression unreadable but his mind racing. Here was the opening he'd been waiting for. Then we'll talk, Jordan said simply, giving Hayes a small nod. Elena turned back toward Sullivan, her voice razor-sharp. Consider this your last warning. Sergeant, cooperate, or I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your career behind bars. Sullivan didn't respond. He simply stood there, rigid and silent, his authority stripped away, his empire collapsing brick by brick. Jordan took one last look around the room, his gaze lingering on Delgado's clenched fists, Hayes's conflicted face, and Sullivan's tightening jaw. He knew then that this was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous was waiting. And as Elena placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, Jordan made a silent promise to himself, no matter how deep the corruption went, no matter how powerful the forces behind it were, he would burn it all down to the ground if that's what it took to bring Cedarville justice. The sun was beginning to set over Cedarville as Jordan Carter sat in a quiet back room of the FBI's temporary command post. His sleeves rolled up, a stack of confiscated files spread out in front of him, his jaw tight as he scrolled through names, dates, and forged signatures that tied everything together like threads in a dark web. Operation Starfall had cracked open the first layer of Cedarville's corruption. But what Jordan was seeing now was worse than he ever imagined. Dozens of arrests, Hundreds of property seizures, entire neighborhoods stripped from Black and Latino families under fabricated charges, forced into selling land to Cedarville Development Company at a fraction of its worth. Deputy Lucas Hayes sat across from Jordan, his face pale but determined, leaning forward as he pointed to a map pinned to the wall. "These are all the properties seized in the last 5 years," he explained, his voice low and tense, tracing a finger along clusters of red marks spreading across Cedarville like an infection. 90% of them were taken after arrests on bogus charges: resisting, possession, trespassing. Every single one of them went through Sullivan's desk. Jordan studied the map carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing as the pattern emerged. The properties formed a near-perfect ring around a massive 400-acre plot, the kind developers salivated over. "And all of this," Jordan muttered, tapping the center of the map, "feeds straight into the Cedarville Development Company." Hayes nodded grimly. "Which," he added, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "isn't actually run by the Thorntons like everyone thinks. It's owned by Mayor Lawrence Bennett's brother-in-law. They've been laundering everything through shell companies." Jordan leaned back slowly, his jaw tightening, memories of his mother Evelyn flashing through his mind. Her wrongful arrest 35 years ago, the night she was dragged out of a community meeting in handcuffs for daring to challenge Cedarville's land policies. He had always suspected there was more to it, but seeing the proof on paper sent a wave of cold fury through his veins. "This isn't just corruption," Jordan said, his voice low and deliberate. "This is organized crime hiding behind government seals." The door creaked open suddenly, and investigative journalist Isabella Morales stepped inside, holding a thick folder stuffed with documents. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, her face drawn but fierce, carrying the weight of years spent fighting this battle alone. "I've been waiting for this moment," she said, placing the folder on the table with quiet determination. 8 years of evidence, wrongful arrests, court transcripts, confidential memos. I've been digging into Bennett and Sullivan since the day they shut down my first story. She pulled out a stack of photos and laid them flat, revealing surveillance shots of private meetings at the Cedarville Golf Club, Bennett, Sullivan, and several local judges seated together, shaking hands with developers over glasses of bourbon. Jordan leaned forward, scanning the images, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Who took these?" Isabella glanced at Hayes, his predecessor. "Deputy Tomlin. He tried to expose all this back in 2018. Hayes looked down, guilt shadowing his features. "Tomlin was fired," he said softly, "and 2 weeks later, he accidentally drowned at Lake Cedar." The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the hum of old ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. Jordan inhaled slowly, steadying himself as he processed the scale of what they were uncovering. "They killed him," he said flatly, his voice heavy but certain. Isabella nodded faintly, and he wasn't the only one. She opened another folder, revealing a list of names: community activists, attorneys, small business owners, all tied to Cedarville's land disputes, all victims of accidents or forced relocations. Jordan's knuckles whitened around the edge of the table, his jaw locking tight. "They've been cleaning house for decades," he said, his voice low, dark, resolute. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice quiet but firm. "And now they're after you. Agent Carter. I overheard Sullivan on the phone with Bennett before the raid. They were talking about staging a car accident, making it look like you lost control on Highway 17. Jordan leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Did Delgado know?" Hayes hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She suggested hiring outsiders, people who couldn't be traced back to Cedarville PD. Jordan's chest tightened, but his face remained unreadable as he exchanged a glance with Isabella. She understood immediately. pulling out her phone and forwarding a file to Elena Vasquez. Within seconds, Elena's voice came through Jordan's earpiece, calm but sharp. "We've got it. Carter, Rico just signed off on expanding the investigation. Bennett, Sullivan, Delgado, Cedarville Development, and their financiers. We're going after all of them." Relief flickered briefly across Jordan's face, but he quickly buried it beneath the weight of what was coming. This wasn't over. Not even close. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his voice steady as he spoke to Hayes and Isabella. "This changes everything," he said, "but it also makes them desperate. If they think they're losing control, they're going to make mistakes, and that's when we'll bring them down." Isabella leaned forward, her voice sharp with determination. "I've got a contact inside the county clerk's office. She's been hiding sealed records for years. Property transfers, tax write-offs. If we get those, we'll have proof Bennett's been funneling money through offshore accounts," Hayes added quickly. "And there's something else. I've seen unmarked vans dropping crates off at Sullivan's farm. No plates, no paperwork. Whatever's in those crates, it's not for the department." Jordan's sharp gaze locked on him instantly. "You can take me there?" Hayes nodded once. "Tonight." Jordan turned to Isabella. "Get a team ready. We'll document everything, but we move quiet. If we spook them too early, they'll burn the evidence." Isabella smirked faintly, a glimmer of fire in her tired eyes. "Trust me, I've been waiting 8 years for this. I'm not about to mess it up now." At that moment, Jordan's phone buzzed on the table, a new message flashing across the encrypted screen. The number was unknown, but the message was short and chilling. "Bennett knew your mother. He ordered her arrest." Jordan froze. His breath caught in his chest as the weight of those words hit him like a freight train. Isabella noticed his reaction immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly, leaning closer. Jordan didn't answer right away, his hand tightening around the phone as his mind reeled. He thought of Evelyn Carter, her soft voice in the nursing home, the way she still winced when she spoke about 1990. All these years, he had blamed the deputies. He had blamed Cedarville PD. But now, standing at the center of this storm, he saw the truth for the first time. Bennett wasn't just part of the system that framed her. He was the architect. Slowly, Jordan placed the phone face down on the table, his expression hardening like steel, his voice low and controlled, but carrying the weight of a man who had just found a deeper purpose. "It's personal now," he said quietly, almost to himself. Isabella reached out, touching his arm gently, her voice steady. "Then we make sure they never hurt anyone else again." Jordan nodded once, his resolve solidifying, his mind already forming the next move. "Tonight," he said firmly, turning to Hayes, "we hit Sullivan's farm, quietly, no mistakes." Hayes straightened, his expression hardening with determination. "I'm with you." Isabella grabbed her camera bag, slinging it over her shoulder, her voice low but fierce. "Let's burn this empire to the ground." Jordan stood, towering over the table, his shadow stretching long across the floor, his voice deep, calm, and relentless. Bennett built his power on lies, fear, and blood. We're about to take all of it away. As the last light of day faded from the windows, the three of them walked out together, their steps quiet but purposeful. The storm was coming, and Jordan Carter was done playing defense. Cedarville thought it had buried its sins, but tonight, the digging would begin. The night was thick with tension, the air heavy and still as Jordan Carter drove slowly down the winding road toward Cedarville Golf Club, headlights cutting through the darkness, every turn carrying him closer to the trap he had set. Hours earlier, he had leaked a piece of bait through a carefully staged conversation, letting it slip where Sullivan's informants could hear. Jordan was planning to build 250 affordable housing units on his 80-acre property, a move that would cripple Cedarville Development Company's $350 million land monopoly, as expected. Mayor Lawrence Bennett panicked and called an emergency meeting at the private golf club, gathering his inner circle, Sergeant Sullivan, Deputy Delgado, County Assessor Richard Vaughn, and 2 developers whose names appeared in offshore accounts tied to Bennett's shell companies. But this time, the meeting wasn't private. Hidden a quarter-mile away, FBI surveillance vans sat in total darkness, their antennas raised, recorders live, and cameras trained on the clubhouse windows, inside Jordan's SUV. Deputy Lucas Hayes sat silently in the passenger seat, checking his wire for the 10th time, his breathing shallow, his palms slick against his jeans. "You're sure this is going to work?" Hayes asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jordan's deep, steady tone filled the silence like steel. "It has to," he said calmly, eyes locked on the road ahead. "They're going to incriminate themselves tonight. Just stick to the plan, in the back seat." Investigative journalist Isabella Morales adjusted her small hidden camera, her face set with quiet determination, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. This was the moment she had been chasing for 8 years, the night everything came to light. As they pulled into the shadow of a grove near the club, Jordan killed the engine and turned to Hayes, his voice low but commanding. "You walk in like you belong there," he said firmly. "Don't overplay it. You're a loyal deputy who just wants to stay on their good side. Keep your head down, listen more than you speak, and whatever you do, don't let Delgado suspect you're wired." Hayes nodded, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Got it," he said. Though his voice betrayed the tremor beneath his resolve, Jordan leaned forward, his dark eyes locking with his. "Hayes, you can still walk away right now. No one would blame you." Hayes shook his head instantly. "No," he said, his voice steadier this time. I'm not letting them destroy more lives." A small flicker of pride crossed Jordan's face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. This wasn't about heroics. It was about survival. Hayes stepped out of the SUV, pulling his cap low over his brow, and made his way toward the clubhouse entrance where 2 armed security guards stood watch. Inside, the golf club's private lounge was dimly lit, the smell of expensive cigars and whiskey hanging heavy in the air. Bennett sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, his tailored navy suit pristine, his gold cufflinks gleaming softly under the warm light. His expression was sharp, calculating, his eyes cold as steel. Sullivan leaned back in his chair across from him, arms crossed, while Delgado paced slowly near the bar, sipping bourbon, her hand resting casually near her holstered Glock. Hayes entered quietly, nodding respectfully as he took a seat near the far end of the table, pretending to be invisible. Bennett's voice carried over the low hum of murmurs, deep and authoritative. "Carter's move puts everything at risk," he said sharply, setting down his glass. "If he builds those units, property values plummet. Our investors pull out. The entire project collapses." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice low and gravelly. "Then we take him out of the equation before he gets started." Delgado smirked slightly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass as she spoke. "We could stage another bust," she suggested casually. "Same playbook as before. This time, we make it stick." Bennett shook his head slowly, his tone cold and precise. "No, it needs to be permanent. No loose ends. We make it look like an accident." Hayes forced himself to stay still, his pulse hammering in his ears as he shifted slightly, trying to steady his breathing. Bennett continued, his voice dropping lower, deadlier. "Highway 17 has no cameras. We stage a blowout. Car flips into the ravine. Done." Isabella's camera captured every word from outside through a long-range mic. Jordan's jaw tightened as he listened through his earpiece, his hand gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He turned to the FBI tactical commander seated beside him. "We've got them," Jordan whispered. "Stay on standby. Inside." Sullivan frowned slightly, his voice betraying an edge of unease. "And what if he survives?" Bennett's icy gaze cut across the room. "He won't." Silence followed his words, thick and suffocating. Hayes swallowed hard, his throat dry. But Delgado broke the tension with a quiet, almost playful chuckle. "Guess Carter picked the wrong town." The room erupted in dark laughter, except Hayes, who kept his head down, silently begging his wire to hold steady. Outside, Isabella glanced at Jordan, whispering urgently, "We've got enough. We should move now." But Jordan shook his head firmly, his deep voice low and resolute. "Not yet. We get the ringleader admitting it. Bennett needs to put himself on the hook, back inside." Bennett leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his voice carrying a finality that sent a chill through Hayes's bones. "Sullivan, you handle Carter. Delgado, you line up the outsiders. No ties to Cedarville. No mistakes this time." Hayes dared to glance up briefly, catching Sullivan's slight nod of agreement, Delgado's cruel grin, and Bennett's calm arrogance as he poured himself another drink. That was the moment Jordan's voice came softly over Hayes's earpiece. "Step outside. Now." Hayes exhaled slowly, rising carefully from his chair, mumbling something about checking security before slipping quietly out into the hallway, the moment the heavy door closed behind him. Jordan emerged from the shadows with 2 FBI agents at his back, his presence commanding, his expression carved from stone. Hayes froze for half a second, stunned by the sudden shift from hunter to hunted, then followed Jordan's signal as they approached the lounge. Inside. Bennett raised his glass to his lips, completely unaware of the storm about to crash through his empire. The door burst open. "FBI!" Elena Vasquez's voice thundered like a shotgun blast as agents poured in, weapons drawn, red laser sights dancing across the walls. "Hands where we can see them! Now!" Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs scraped against the polished floor, glasses shattered, and Sullivan shot to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt before 3 rifles locked onto him. Delgado raised both hands slowly, her smirk gone, her composure cracking for the first time. Bennett stood frozen, his face pale but his voice sharp with authority. "This is outrageous. You have no jurisdiction here." Elena strode in, her presence radiating command, federal corruption, racketeering, conspiracy. "Trust me, Mr. Mayor. We have jurisdiction." Jordan stepped forward from behind her, his deep voice steady, calm, and final. "This ends tonight." Bennett's jaw tightened, his defiance waning as agents seized his phone, tablet, and documents from the table. Sullivan glared at Jordan, his cold blue eyes filled with venom, but said nothing as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Delgado didn't resist, but her whisper carried across the silence as she passed Jordan. "Bennett feared you," she said softly, almost with bitter amusement. "Because of your mother." She knew too much. Jordan's heart tightened at her words, but his face remained unreadable, his voice steady as he watched the 3 of them taken into custody. "You'll answer for every life you've destroyed," he said quietly. Bennett turned his head slightly, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You think this ends with me? Carter? You have no idea how deep this goes." Jordan didn't flinch. "Then I'll keep digging," he said, his tone flat, absolute, as the agents escorted Bennett, Sullivan, and Delgado out of the building. Isabella lowered her camera slowly, her voice low with awe. "You just took down half the power structure of this county," she whispered. Jordan's gaze stayed fixed on the dark road beyond the windows, his jaw tight, his deep voice steady as he answered. "Not yet. This was just the front line. The real war starts now, 8 months later. The federal courthouse in Birmingham stood like a monument to justice, its marble steps crowded with reporters, flashing cameras, and protesters holding signs demanding accountability inside the packed courtroom. Silence reigned as the trial against Mayor Lawrence Bennett, Sergeant Derek Sullivan, Deputy Mia Delgado, and 6 other co-defendants reached its climax. For many, this case was about corruption, power, and greed. But for Jordan Carter, seated at the prosecution's table in a crisp navy suit, it was personal. This was about his mother, Evelyn Carter, about her stolen dignity, and about every family Cedarville had crushed under decades of systemic abuse. Judge Clara Thompson, a respected federal judge from Montgomery, presided from the bench with sharp, steady authority. Her piercing gaze swept the room, commanding silence without a word. At the prosecution's table, U.S. Attorney Adriana Lopez organized a stack of documents, her calm demeanor hiding the intensity behind her dark eyes. After 18 years of prosecuting corruption cases, this was one of the biggest battles of her career. Across the aisle, Mayor Bennett sat rigid in his tailored gray suit, his silver hair immaculate but his complexion pale. Gone was the arrogance that once defined him. In its place was a cold, tight expression betraying the weight of the charges. Beside him, Sullivan's pale blue eyes darted nervously across the jury box, while Delgado leaned back in her chair, arms folded, her jaw set in stubborn defiance. The defense attorneys whispered frantically among themselves, their strategy unraveling under the mountain of evidence collected by Operation Starfall. The first witness called was Isabella Morales, the investigative journalist whose 8 years of relentless digging had laid the groundwork for the case. She walked to the stand with quiet confidence, raising her right hand to swear the oath, her voice steady as she told the jury how she had tracked Cedarville Development Company's financial ties. This was never just a local project, Isabella said, her tone clear and composed. Mayor Bennett and his associates coordinated a network of wrongful arrests and forced property sales, funneling seized land through shell companies connected to his family. We traced over $78 million through offshore accounts tied directly to Bennett. Adriana projected documents on the evidence screen, photographs, memos, bank statements, each one landing like a hammer blow. The jury leaned forward, silent and tense, absorbing every detail. When Bennett's attorney tried to discredit Isabella during cross-examination, accusing her of bias, she met his challenge with calm strength. "I didn't create these numbers," she said firmly. "I followed the money, and the money led right here." The prosecution's next witness was Deputy Lucas Hayes, wearing his uniform. He looked younger than his 27 years, his hands clasped tightly as he sat before the jury. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each word. "I joined Cedarville PD to protect people," he said softly. "But I saw early on how wrong things were. Sullivan and Delgado planted drugs, fabricated charges, and used intimidation to force families off their land. I was ordered to participate, but when I realized how deep it went, I couldn't stay silent anymore." He described late-night meetings at the Cedarville Golf Club, the conversations where Bennett plotted to expand his land empire, and how he secretly wore a wire the night Bennett ordered a staged accident to eliminate Jordan Carter. As Hayes spoke, Sullivan stared at him with cold fury. Delgado shook her head in disbelief, and Bennett sat motionless, his jaw clenched tightly. But the damage was done. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Adriana called Jordan Carter to the stand. The room hushed instantly as he rose from his seat and walked to the witness chair, his presence commanding without a single word. After swearing the oath, he sat tall, his deep voice steady as Adriana began. "Agent Carter, as the lead investigator on Operation Starfall, can you explain why this case is personal for you?" Jordan's gaze swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on his mother, Evelyn seated in the front row, her frail hands clasped tightly, tears welling in her eyes. He drew a slow breath, his words measured but heavy with emotion. 35 years ago, my mother was arrested during a community meeting while advocating for minority families being pushed off their land. She spent 7 years in prison for charges fabricated by this same department. Obstruction, disorderly conduct, all lies meant to silence her voice. His deep voice hardened as his eyes locked on Bennett. I became an FBI agent because of what happened to her, and during this investigation, I discovered that her arrest wasn't random, it was ordered by Mayor Lawrence Bennett. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn lowered her head, her shoulders trembling as silent tears streamed down her face. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his composure cracking for the first time as murmurs filled the gallery. Adriana guided Jordan through his testimony, detailing months of investigative work, the planted drugs on his truck, the military-grade surveillance equipment found on his property, the financial trail connecting Cedarville Development Company to offshore accounts, and the wiretap recordings capturing Bennett authorizing his accidental death. The defense tried to paint Jordan as a man seeking revenge, but his response was calm, clear, and devastating. "This isn't about revenge," he said firmly. "This is about justice. The evidence speaks for itself. Over 3 grueling weeks, jurors listened to witnesses recount their nightmares, families evicted under false pretenses, small business owners stripped of their properties, children forced to sleep in cars after losing their homes. One elderly veteran broke down on the stand as he described being jailed on false charges so his land could be seized for pennies on the dollar. Each testimony layered another brick onto the mountain of evidence. By the time Adriana delivered her closing argument, the weight of truth was overwhelming. "This case," she said, her voice rising with quiet power, "isn't just about corruption. It's about dignity. It's about the abuse of power against the most vulnerable among us. For decades, these defendants exploited their badges and offices to destroy lives for profit. Today, you decide if Cedarville belongs to them, or if it belongs to justice." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Clara Thompson read aloud, her voice firm and steady. On 52 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations, we find the defendants guilty. A ripple of emotion swept through the room. Bennett sat frozen, his pale face slack with disbelief. Sullivan's hands shook slightly as deputies moved toward him, while Delgado exhaled slowly, lowering her head at last. In the front row, Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, her tears unstoppable. Jordan stepped down from the stand and crossed the courtroom slowly, kneeling beside her, taking her fragile hands gently in his. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm proud of you, son." Jordan's deep voice trembled slightly, the first crack in his composure all day. "We did it, Mama," he said softly. "Your name is clear." The summer sun dipped low over Cedarville, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, as the once divided town gathered on the wide, open grounds of Jordan Carter's 80-acre property. 8 months had passed since the trial, but its impact still rippled through every street, every home, every life. The verdict had shattered the old power structure, ending decades of fear and silence. Mayor Lawrence Bennett was serving a 40-year sentence in federal prison. Sergeant Derek Sullivan and Deputy Mia Delgado were behind bars for civil rights violations, and the Cedarville Development Company had been dismantled entirely, its assets seized and redistributed to families who had been wrongfully stripped of their land. But for Jordan, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about healing. That's why. On this warm afternoon, Hundreds of Cedarville's residents stood beneath a white canopy as Jordan stepped up to the podium, the breeze tugging lightly at the edges of his navy blazer, his deep voice steady as it carried across the crowd. "Today," he began, pausing to meet the eyes of those gathered before him, "isn't about what was taken from us. It's about what we're building together." A murmur of quiet agreement swept through the audience. Faces old and young turned toward him with hope glimmering where fear used to live. Behind Jordan stood a tall white banner with bold black lettering, the Carter Community Center, where there had once been silence, neglect, and intimidation. A new vision now rose from the very land Cedarville's leaders had tried to steal, the center. Funded partly by seized assets and partly by federal grants secured through Operation Starfall, would serve as a sanctuary for education, legal aid, and opportunity. Inside its walls, families could access free legal counseling, small business workshops, and youth mentorship programs designed to break cycles of poverty and discrimination. And in the heart of the complex, a small memorial garden bore plaques engraved with the names of every family once targeted by Cedarville's corrupt network, a permanent reminder that their suffering had not been forgotten. Isabella Morales stood off to the side, camera in hand, recording the historic day for her upcoming documentary about the investigation. She caught Jordan's profile as he gestured to the crowd, his deep voice resonant and full of purpose. "For too long," he said, "this town belonged to a few who used fear to control the many. But Cedarville isn't theirs anymore. It's yours. It's ours." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound rising like a wave of collective relief and triumph. Near the front, Evelyn Carter sat in a wheelchair, her frail hands folded in her lap, tears glimmering in her eyes as she watched her son reclaim the dignity she had fought for decades earlier. Jordan glanced her way briefly, his expression softening before he continued. 35 years ago, my mother stood against this system and paid a price no one should ever have to pay. Today, we honor her courage, and the courage of everyone who refused to be silenced." A hush fell over the crowd as Jordan's words carried across the open field, their weight settling into the hearts of those listening. For many, this was the first time they felt truly seen. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, waving small flags printed with the center's logo, while older residents clasped one another's hands tightly, some openly weeping, as the ceremony continued. Newly appointed Sheriff Maria Alvarez stepped to the podium beside Jordan, appointed after Sullivan's conviction. She had spent the past 6 months rebuilding the Cedarville Sheriff's Department from the ground up, replacing corrupt leadership with officers committed to transparency and accountability. Her voice rang clear as she addressed the crowd. "We've reduced wrongful arrests in Cedarville by over 80%, she said proudly. "And we've launched a citizens' oversight board to make sure this department serves the people, not itself." Applause rolled through the crowd again, louder this time, a testament to the sweeping changes already reshaping Cedarville's future. After Alvarez spoke, Jordan returned to the microphone, his tone gentler now, warmer. "Justice isn't just about holding people accountable," he said. "It's about giving people the tools to rebuild what was lost. It's about investing in our kids, supporting our families, and protecting the rights of every person who calls Cedarville home." The Carter Community Center embodied that promise. In its first phase, it offered free tutoring programs for children from low-income families, job training initiatives for adults seeking employment, and mental health counseling for those scarred by years of intimidation and abuse. Within 6 months, over 200 residents had enrolled in new certification programs, and more than 40 small businesses had received startup grants funded directly from the assets seized during the investigation. For Jordan, though, the most meaningful part of the center wasn't the statistics. It was the conversations. Every week, He met with families who had once been his mother's neighbors, people who had endured the same injustices Evelyn fought against decades ago. They came carrying stories of struggle and resilience, and together they began rewriting Cedarville's history, one voice at a time. Later that afternoon, after the ceremony ended, Jordan walked slowly along a stone pathway through the memorial garden, Evelyn's wheelchair rolling gently beside him as Isabella followed with her camera. Evelyn's hand brushed lightly over one of the plaques, her voice soft and trembling. "So many names," she whispered. Jordan looked down at her, his deep voice quiet but steady. "And not one forgotten," he said. Evelyn nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, and Jordan knelt beside her, resting a hand on hers. "Mama," he said softly, his voice breaking just slightly. "This is what we fought for. This is what you fought for." She smiled faintly, her frail fingers tightening around his. "No, son," she whispered. "This is what you built." As the sun dipped below the horizon, its last golden rays bathing the Carter Community Center in warm light, Jordan stood before the building, hands clasped behind his back, his heart steady, his purpose clear. Cedarville had been broken by greed and corruption, but now, brick by brick, it was healing. And though the fight for justice was far from over, one thing was certain: Cedarville's future no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the people. Jordan turned slightly, watching as children ran across the grass, their laughter ringing through the air, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, free of the weight he had carried since he was a boy. The land once stolen, once tainted by betrayal and abuse, now stood as a beacon of hope, reborn through sacrifice, resilience, and unity. And as dusk settled over the town, Jordan whispered to himself, almost as a promise, "Cedarville, we're home again." Thank you for watching this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story.